more about me. So as Trish said, I have been working with Dynamics NAV for 12 years. My experience has been in a number of different roles, both as a user, analyst, developer, implementer, and solution architect. I've led many implementation projects, upgrades, re-implementation. I'm also a volunteer on the NAVUG board and the programming committee for NAVUG, so hopefully everybody on this call is a member of NAVUG. If not, it's a great place to find all kinds of resources about NAV, so I always encourage people to check that out. And then we just want to kind of find out a little bit about who's on the call today. So we have two polls we're going to do. The first one, Trish, if you could go ahead and do the poll to find out what version everybody is on. All right. And so looks like we have a pretty good mix of different versions. Okay. So we've got a mix of 2009 or older, 2013, 2015, and then the other poll that I wanted to do just real quick was just to find out what roles you're in. So Trish, if you could do that next poll. Okay, good. So looks like we have a mix of finance and IT on the phone. So that's perfect. And just kind of want to go over the agenda real quick today. So what we're going to cover today are the security risks in NAV. Just out of the box, we're going to look at NAV out of the box with no add-ons or anything and look at where your biggest security risks are. We're going to look at designing security versus designing security and implementing versus just implementing. We'll look at permissions in NAV. We'll look at tracking changes. We'll look at managing development, and we'll look at security reporting. So when we talk about security in NAV, it's a lot more than just permissions. So when you look at NAV and just out of the box, if you look at the standard NAV roles out of the box, there's a lot of permissions in those roles. You've all seen them. You've all probably had experience with some of the security, setting it up. If you're in IT, you've had that experience of setting up security for users. There's really nothing that kind of helps you break those down out of the box. So the other risk that you have is there's no easy way to review permissions. There's nothing automatically that's going to help you do that. It's really just kind of going in, looking at NAV, looking at screens in NAV. There's no reports or anything like that. There's no way to track changes. There's no way to know who's changing data in your system just out of the box. The change log is not turned on when it comes out of the box, so that's something that you would have to turn on. There's no automatic documenting of changes to the objects. So when you look at security in NAV, you need to know not only who has permission to do things, you also need to know what they're changing and then what's changing your database as well. So that's where when we get to the changing of objects, there's really nothing out of the box that forces a developer or a partner, whoever's modifying your database, to actually document the changes that they're doing. So that really kind of creates a huge risk because you can't really see if nobody's documenting it or adding a version to it. You can't really see what's going on. Then there's also just no robust reporting out of the box to look at all of these things, to look at who has permissions to what, the ability to actually review permissions, the ability to review your changes. There's no kind of out-of-the-box reporting that helps you do that. So as we go through these areas, we're going to look at, we'll look at the best practices in each of these areas as we go through today. And the first one I want to start with is designing versus implementing security. So one of the things that I know when I was first learning NAV and when I was first setting up security, you know, security is kind of one of those things in your projects that always you kind of don't have enough time to do. It's one of those things that gets pushed off to the end. you're really kind of like, oh man, we need to do this, but now we're running out of time. We have like 2 days before go live, and now you're just rushing to get security done. And I think that's where the difference between designing and really sitting down and taking some time to actually lay that out versus really having to struggle just kind of trying to make things up as you go along is where you can really help yourself nail down your security and really tighten it up so that you have something that's really going to be easy for you to review, easy for you to work with, all of those things. So when we talk about designing security, what we want to talk about is you need to pick a tool kind of to use to actually do it. So a lot of people use Excel for a lot of different things. Excel is a pretty good tool to use if you're going to document your security and really do that design. We'll look at an example of that in a minute here, but what that'll allow you to do is actually sit down and take the time to identify the roles and the groups in your organization. Really kind of say, what are my different roles? You know, how many roles in accounting do I have? So maybe I have an accounting manager, I have a CFO, I have an accounting clerk, maybe I have 5 accounting clerks, but really what's my difference between those accounting clerks? So really sit down and think through that. Then what you want to do is once you've identified the different roles or the different groups that you have, then go through and say what is it that each role or group needs to be able to access, or what do they need to actually be able to do. You're going to want to review this, you're going to want to review your design with the managers and maybe even have them help you come up with a design for each of those roles or groups. So, you know, the CFO or the accounting manager, you definitely want to make sure that you involve them because ultimately at the end of the day, they're going to be the ones that have to actually approve those permissions that you're granting people. And the thing you want to remember too is that when you're designing security, less is more. So when you look at the roles and when you look at what people need to access in the system or be able to execute, what processes they need to be able to execute, you really want to think through, do I really need to actually be able to insert into this table or read this table? Can I really just get away with just reading this table? And we'll kind of talk about that more as we get into the permissions. But let's just take a quick look. This is one of the tools that Mark Polino on our staff has developed. It's actually for GP, so this is something that it's an example of what GP users can do to actually lay out and design their security before they implement it. So it's really, this is pretty in-depth and pretty involved, but it's still, if you look at this, just the headings across the top here, it's still pretty high level. So it makes it really easy to kind of quickly see, okay, I have in my accounting department, for example, for this example, we have an AP manager, an AP staff, an AR manager, AR staff, controller. So it's listing these, they've identified that we have these roles in the accounting department. And then what you would do is actually go across for each role and really kind of decide what is it that this role needs to be able to do. So does the AP manager need to be able to set up payables? Do they need to set up vendor classes? Do they need to be able to set up purchase order information? So all of these processes, he's also grouped those into kind of like a group of permissions or a actually like a group of permissions. So for example, he's calling this the purchasing admin group. So these would be all the types of admin functions that somebody would have to do for purchasing. And if we kind of scroll over here, then he's kind of taking the different areas that you have access to inside of NAV. So purchasing cards, or I'm sorry, inside of GP. So purchasing cards, purchasing inquiries, and then the actual processes in those areas that somebody might have to do. And you can kind of see how this kind of just goes through the different areas and then what's actually available for somebody to do in those different areas. And if we look across the bottom, what we've kind of done is Mark's broken it down into also the different sales, AP, inventory, financial, those types of areas as well. So this is a really good example. It is pretty involved, but it's a really good example that would be one way how you can design your security, and really sitting down and taking the time to do this is really going to help you out. It's going to be documentation you can use for an auditor to show them. It's documentation you can use for managers to actually be able to review it, because if you look inside of standard NAV, and if you were to try and have somebody review maybe what the AP manager has assigned to them, it's not as easily kind of laid out as this is here. So, so if I marked all this stuff and, marked a couple things over here, and that's what we went ahead and set up, this would be very easy for people to look at and say, yep, that makes sense, that's what somebody should have. Okay, so let's jump back into the slideshow. Okay. And then as you kind of look at, once you've designed your security, and it's a great opportunity when you're going through either an upgrade or an implementation or re-implementation to really take the time to do that security design. But after you do that security design, it's really important to actually understand the security model inside of NAV. So really, when we look at the security model, the root of everything is going to start here. It's going to start segregation of duties analysis is going to start here, being compliant, reporting, all of that starts with the user, the permission sets, the permissions, and how all of that interacts with each other. So this is kind of a really just a quick guide to how that works. So a user is going to be assigned a permission set. In those permission sets, you're going to have permissions. You're going to have the ability to read, insert, modify, delete table data. You have indirect permissions as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit further down when we actually look at how you set up the permissions. You're going to be able to execute on all objects or not. You're going to see that there's also kind of some out-of-the-box basic permission sets where you can kind of give everybody needs these basic permissions to actually be able to access NAV. So it's all of those objects you need to be able to log in, minus the table data, the systems tables, and the change log. And then when we talk about permissions as well, you can limit those permissions to per company access. So that's a really good practice to get into, especially if you have multiple companies and not everybody needs to be in every company. You definitely want to make the choice to actually limit their access by company. Out of the box, it may default to, depending on what version you're on, it may just default to have that company field blank. So you do want to make sure that you are thinking through when you're designing security, does this person need access to these companies? Now, a lot of times with the accounting people, they do need access to multiple companies. So it's really kind of more of the other users making sure if they don't need access to it, they don't have access to it. Then there's also the different user credential types. So we have the Windows authentication, you have the NAV authentication. I don't know how many people still use kind of that NAV authentication, which is at the database level. Then there's Windows groups, and now with 2016 you have the user groups. And then this is just kind of a nice visual to show that kind of highlights what we just talked about and how the security model interacts with each other. This would be the for all versions that are not 2016, so all like 2015 and down. And then this would be the 2016 security model. So here you can see there's the inclusion of the user groups. And I really think that when you talk about the user groups versus Active Directory groups, the concept of user groups, it's a lot like Active Directory groups in the fact that it is the concept of creating a group that you can then assign to a group of users, and that group has set of permissions assigned to it. So, for example, if I had 5 accounting clerks that all did the same thing, I could set up an accounting clerk group. I could assign the permissions to that group and then assign that group to those users. So it cuts down on the amount of time you have to use setting up security, and it also kind of keeps your permissions group cleaner, because the whole concept is to actually keep it smaller, keep it a really refined group of permissions that you're reviewing on a regular basis. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more when we go into actually setting up permissions. And so just did a couple of quick screenshots when you're looking at permissions and looking at setting them up. Just keep in mind it's showing here is kind of illustrating what we talked about earlier as far as what you have permission to and the permissions to be able to read, insert, modify, or delete. So just a couple of quick screenshots on that. Again, the basic role is one that you can assign to everybody. It's got a permission set in there that's just going to let them, enable them to log in. One of the things too that you want to actually look at, and one of the things that you want to review on a regular basis, is the super role. And out of the box, NAV is going to come with super and super data. So those two roles really give everybody, it grants a ton of access. In this case, this is one case where the word super is really not a super thing. So you really want to make sure that you're careful when you use it, you know who you're using it for, what their role is, and that it makes sense for their role. Because it is a very dangerous thing. So in a couple of cases I have seen where people have implemented databases, they ran out of time to do security, and everybody in their database had super. And it's not that people will do bad things with it on purpose, it's just that they may not understand that they have access to things, and if they delete something that they shouldn't, it's more because they just didn't really know what they were doing. So this is one thing out of the box. It's a huge, it presents a huge risk for you. You really want to be careful about when you assign that and who has that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the permissions area, and also in the when we talk about managing development as well. So just out of the box, your first user that you create in Dynamics NAV is usually going to be assigned super. It has permissions to everything. One of the recommendations, one of the best practices, is to actually create a super read role, where you take everything that was assigned in the super role and assign it read permissions instead. So that's one thing that you'll want to look at, especially in your live environment. If you have a dev, test, and live environment, that's where you can actually look at that and really try and figure out who needs to have access to live as a super user. I know that sometimes you need to troubleshoot things in live, and there are times when you do need that super role, but it's something you're going to want to really keep to a minimum. And depending on your organization or your audit requirements or your software customization requirements, that's where you want to look at, do I put everybody as super read, and then if there's something they can't solve, they have to request super access. You grant them super access, but there's a paper trail of that actual approval and the access being granted and then taken away. So those are things that you need to really think about when you're thinking about security, because that's probably one of the biggest risks that you can have security-wise. Okay, and then just a couple of quick screenshots of the super role, so you can kind of see that. And again, we'll take a look at that a little bit better as we get down into the different areas. Okay, and so just want to kind of talk about some of the standard NAV security features. So obviously in 2016, and we are going to look at 2016, the concepts will be the same for the other versions. You definitely want to look at how you're creating those permissions and those roles. We are going to look at the permissions recorder. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on user groups and Active Directory groups, and the reason for that is it'll become apparent to you when you're kind of designing security whether it makes sense for you to use user groups or AD groups. If you only have 10 employees or 20 employees and you start trying to lay out and design the security, you'll see really quickly whether you have multiple people in a role or not. So it's kind of based on that and what your what your auditors are looking for and what your auditors are recommending you do, that you kind of have to make a decision at that point and say, okay, does it make sense for me to use user groups if I'm only assigning one person to each user group, or maybe I have 200 users and I really am going to have 10 people in this user group, so it does make sense for me to do that. Okay, and I'm gonna jump over to NAV real quick here, and we'll just kind of look at some permissions over here, and we'll look at the recorder as well. So out of the box, you've all seen the roles that come with NAV out of the box, and some of them are okay with the naming. You can kind of tell what it should be, but a lot of these will have a lot of permissions to things that maybe somebody doesn't need, and that's where the design and security will come into play. But so best practice, what you want to do is actually create your own roles. I would leave all of the roles that are there that come out of the box until I actually had my roles defined and working and tested before I went ahead and deleted these. I've seen some discussions on should you leave them, should you take them out. I tend to leave them until I know my stuff is working, and then if you wanted, you could delete them. I mean, you could always get these back. You could, if you have a Kronos version of the database, those roles will be in there. So it's not like a huge thing if you delete them and then you figure out sometime later you actually want to look at one of these, or you actually want to use one. But the biggest thing is to actually make sure that you understand what's in them and that your users can understand what's in them. So really, best practice when you're looking at setting up permission sets is to create smaller subsets of permissions that make it easier to really control what people have access to and to actually make it easier for people to review. So I've created a couple here, and we'll just kind of take a look here at this one. So I used the permissions recorder to create a new customer. So when I look at this, what it's done is it's actually, as I created a new customer, it recorded the permissions that I was going to use, or that I was going to need to actually create that customer. And it included a lot of the lookups that I would have to do as well. And so when you look at, if I've created a customer, it's also would be the same as viewing a customer. But so the first thing I did was try and pick a name. I wasn't very creative here. I'm sure you can come up with some better names, but you want to try and pick a name that's going to make sense to somebody that's not in IT to be able to review, because what you really want to make sure is that somebody, just a manager or a CFO or a CIO or a director of IT or somebody that's not as familiar with security can actually view the permissions that somebody has and be able to tell that yes, this is the correct permissions for this person, or it's not the correct permissions for this person. Because when you actually start looking at what's in this, it makes it hard for somebody that doesn't really know that, hey, table 37 is the sales line. I don't know if that should be there or not. But if I have a name and a description that really is descriptive of what this permission is, it's going to be easier for that manager to review it, to know for sure what's in that role, what they're getting access to. And if you look here, it is kind of nice because the recorder will tell you if there's any additional tables that you need read access to. So it's going to give you all those related table permissions. So when I create a customer, I have to be able to select a general business posting group. So I know that I'm going to need access to that. Obviously, using the recorder makes this a lot easier. When you're in 2013, 2015, 2009 or older, it is very hard to come up with some of this. So it's not an easy thing. I know it's not an easy thing to redo your roles, but if you design them and you take your time and just kind of say, okay, which department or which roles do I have, where do I have the greatest risk at? You can always start with those and then just kind of keep doing it from there. So if you have those older versions of NAV, it is going to be cumbersome. It is going to take some trial and error, and it really does, for lack of a better word, suck doing those permissions by hand. The best thing you can do is kind of start taking guesses at which are the related tables, because that's where you're going to run into trouble. When you're in 2013 or 2009, you're going to say, okay, I know I got to have access to the customer table. I know I got to have access to read the ledger entries if I want to look up history, sales lines if I want to look up open orders. So by going through the actual customer card, you can kind of get a feel for some of those related tables that you might need, but it's definitely probably going to take you a couple of times, and you're going to have issues where you miss a related table. It's just going to happen. Because like you're not going to know that maybe I have contacts turned on and I missed that relation that I needed. Or like this one here, social listening search topic. I'm not really sure what that one is. So there'll be a couple that you miss, but if you kind of start from the place of, hey, I'm going to build this role that's going to be able to create a customer and view a customer. If I actually walk through this, what are the tables here that I'm going to need to be able to have access to just look up and have to read into to actually select a value. So it's time consuming. It does take you some time, but it is worth it in the end because it is going to reduce ultimately it's going to reduce your risk, because you're going to know what people have access to, and you're going to really be able to limit some of those things that they shouldn't have access to. So we're just going to go back here real quick, and let's just do one. I think I'm okay on time here. So I'm going to say create vendor, because vendor is one that auditors are always looking at, and of course I didn't put. The vendor is going to be one that auditors are always going to look at. It's a huge area of risk for you. If somebody can create a vendor and they can create a PO and they can cut a check, it's one of the easiest places for somebody to do something malicious. So it's definitely one of the areas you want to watch. It's one that you want to review on a regular basis, and it's definitely one you want to limit the amount of permissions that people have to that area. So I'm going to create this, then I'm going to go here. I go to actions, and then it's a little, hopefully you can see it up there, but this is the record permissions here, start and stop. I'm going to check that I do want it to add read permissions to the related tables, and I'm going to go ahead and say record. I haven't done any previous recordings, so I don't have anything cached in here, so I'm okay to go ahead and record right now. So go back to the vendors list. I'm going to do new. I'm going to do Rita's. I'm going to do my favorite vendor, Rita's House of Tequila. Let's do Northeast. do US, do purchaser code, don't want that. I'm going to select general business posting group here. So again, and if you don't have the recorder, this would be something where you just kind of go through and you say, okay, I needed to look up these. What's the bare minimum of permissions that I would need to do this? So I know I would need to have read permission to this table. I know I'd need to have read permissions to vendor posting group, those types of things. So in your first pass, you can get pretty close. It's always those kind of just weird stuff that you may have turned on that you don't realize, like an ISV or something like that that's turned on, that you kind of forget is there, and that just kind of runs in the background. So I'm going to say okay. Yeah, that's fine. So I have some contact. I have a conflict on my contact there. And let me go back to where I'm recording it. So now if I stop this, I'm going to add all of my recorded permissions. So you can see that it went in and said, okay, I need to have access, read access to the zip code, to the posting group, the social listening, the contacts, etc. Okay. All right, so let's go back here. So once you've set up permissions, one of the things that you kind of want to do as well, even when you're designing them, is what you want to keep in mind is segregation of duties. So auditors are always looking at what are your risks when it comes to segregation of duties, and how are you mitigating against those. There is nothing out of the box in standard NAV that deals with segregation of duties. It's kind of just something, it's more a methodology that you have to follow. There's a rule set that can identify the conflicts in your system, and you know, you can look those up on some of the auditing websites to kind of get a feel for that, or talk to your auditors, because I'm sure they've kind of said, you know, if somebody, the main one that most auditors are always worried about is, you know, if you can create a vendor and a PO and cut a check, that's a huge risk, and that's something that you need to mitigate. So make sure when you're granting people in your organization the ability to create a vendor and create a PO, that you have a good process in place to actually manage that. And what that means is you want to make sure that maybe you have dual approvals for a new vendor. So one person can enter it, and then somebody has to review it and approve it, and then it's able to be live in your system. So one person may start the initial setup of the vendor, they may block them, then they have somebody else that reviews it, unblocks them, you know, make sure that the address doesn't match you know, somebody's home address or something like that. Then you also want to review on a regular basis what vendors were actually set up, what new vendors were set up, to see if there's anything suspicious. You also can build a custom solution, automated or manual. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of, it's really would be a lot of figuring out to actually create a report inside of NAV to actually tell you that. Now, you could just focus on who has access to create a vendor, who has access to create a PO, because that's, and who has access to create a check, who has all three of those things. You could create that. At the company I was at, we actually created a couple of SQL scripts to be able to pull things for the auditors that would lay out some of that stuff, but again, it's really complicated. A lot of times it's something that's pretty hard to do. You want to make sure that you just have a really good methodology for setting up vendors, for approving vendors, for creating them, modifying them, and then have somebody reviewing those on a regular basis. I can't stress how important that is. Anything that there's an opportunity for somebody to set up a fictitious vendor and pay themselves, create a PO and pay themselves, that's probably the easiest one to identify, and it's the easiest one to watch on a regular basis. So that kind of falls in line with that next point, the manual transaction sampling. So making sure that you're looking at vendor changes, comparing, pulling samplings of purchase orders to make sure that somebody hasn't updated the addresses, things like that. And really, again, stressing the fact that process controls are important. It is one way of dealing with the fact that NAV doesn't have any standard functionality for segregation of duties. And it's always kind of a balance of process controls and system security. Again, because a lot of companies are not big enough to have one person that only enters vendors and one person that only does POs. It's just, it's not really the norm in a lot of the companies that actually run NAV. A lot of the companies are small to medium businesses and multiple people are performing multiple roles. So making sure that you have a good process for monitoring those, monitoring your risks and mitigating against them will go a long way. The next area I want to talk about in regards to security, again, is tracking your changes. So like we said, there's nothing kind of out of the box turned on. It's something you have to turn on. So when you look at what are the things I should be monitoring, a lot of times it's going to be the things that your auditor is looking for. So I hate to keep picking on vendor, but it's probably the easiest one. So monitoring who's changing the vendors, who's adding vendors, who's updating vendors, that's one that totally makes sense to turn on the changelog for. And we'll take a look at that here in a second. But it's something that you want to really say, again, it's kind of like when we were talking about designing the permissions, you also want to sit down and kind of design what are the things that I want to track change-wise, and what are the things I want to review on a regular basis. It's especially if you're turning on the change log and NAV, you do need to take into consideration performance. If anybody has ever used the change log, it's definitely it can be very frustrating to try and get information back out of it, depending on how long it actually, or how long it's been in use and how big it's grown. So it's very important to consider that, especially in the older versions. 2015, 2016, performance is better overall. It still can affect it, it's still going to affect it, but when you're talking more, 2009, 2013, the changelog can be just a really big performance hog because it's competing as well with the transactions inside the database. So if you've got a changelog that you turned on for example, I don't know, say you're tracking some transactions, it can generate a lot of data really quickly. So you really want to be careful about what you're turning it on for. You really want to say, if I want to look at the vendor and I want to look at the changes, I'm not going to turn every field on because that, again, that's a row. Each field that you're turning on is a row in the table. So you really want to make sure that you are turning on the least amount possible. Plus, it's just kind of impossible to review. If the vendor table has over 100 and some fields in it, you're not going to look at all 100 fields. What are the ones that make sense? And we'll look at that in a second. So the other thing is that the changelog is only going to track changes inside of Dynamics NAV. So it's only going to track the things that happen through the NAV interface. So if somebody actually goes into your SQL database and changes or updates information, this is not going to track that. So you'll also want to make sure that you look at the security and who has access to your SQL database to make sure that that's kept to a minimum, that you know who's making changes there as well. And again, there's nothing out of the box to kind of track that. It's really more a process at that point for you that you'll have to track. Then when we look at the at how changes are made at the database level, so it's made by the NAV service count. So when changes are made inside of NAV, it's going to track that for 2013 and up. It's going to track that. It's going to record the username, but it's also going to do that through the NAV service count. So this is just a couple of screenshots on the changelog setup, and again, we'll go in and look at that real quickly here. Changelog entries, an example of the changelog turned on, the old and new values, you can see that there. So again, once you decide what you want to track, then what you're going to want to do is make sure that you review it. So it's not enough when you're monitoring security inside of Dynamics NAV to just turn on the changelog. You've got to review those entries on a regular basis to make sure that there isn't anything bad happening. All right, so let's go over to NAV. Get back here. And so I've turned on some fields here, so let's just take a quick look here. So for the vendor, what I've turned on is, I'm just looking at the insert right now, but it will turn on the same fields when I select some fields for the rest of them. So I really want to kind of think through what are the things that somebody could change that an auditor would be concerned about. So when you look at the vendor, its name, its address, its city, maybe the vendor posting group. Let's go down a little bit further here. General business posting group, zip code. You know, we want to make sure they're not changing it to different country or different state. All of those types of things. I don't need to know. Well, maybe I do need to know the email. State, need to know, but I probably don't need to know if they changed, you know, the fax number. You know, do I really care that they changed the fax number? It's really more those address fields or any field that could affect where money is posting to or from, or discounts or payment terms. Those types of things are things that you're definitely going to want to keep an eye on. So, you know, maybe I, you know, am working with a vendor and I give them more beneficial, actually not on the vendor side, but on the customer side. If I was working with a customer and I gave them more favorable payment terms, you know, that might be something that was advantageous to them, and you know, they gave me a kickback because of that, something like that. So it's those things that you want to think through and kind of say, okay, what are the ones that we need to track for our company to meet our audit requirements? Okay, and so customer as well, again, it's you know, one of those ones where, you know, they could go the long way around and maybe they set up a fictitious customer to buy from the fictitious vendor, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, that's always usually one that auditors look at as well. So it's really kind of going through and saying, okay, when I look at NAV and what are the things that my auditor is looking for, this is where you'll come in and say, all right, I'm going to track the vendor, I'm going to track the customer, maybe I'm going to track bank accounts, maybe there's some things on the item table that I need to track, those types of things. And again, it should be pretty clear based on what you get audited on and all of that. So definitely best practices for the changelog is to make sure that you only turn on the least amount of fields you need. I mean, you can always go back and turn more on if you need to, but it's going to be a good thing for you to review it with your auditors. You know what they ask for, and set up, you know, those things only. Don't go extra. Don't say, oh, I might need this or I might need that. If you don't need it, don't turn it on. The other area that I kind of want to talk about when we talk about security is really managing the development or customization of your NAV environment as well. So on a regular basis, you really want to review who has super access to your database. That's one of the easiest things you can do, but it's something that's really important based on what that role gives people access to. I can't stress enough, I've been in environments where people have had super access and they've done some very bad things, not on purpose, but just because they didn't know. So it's definitely something you want to look at. It's definitely something you want to make sure if you're in the process of going through an implementation or you know, a go live or anything like that, make sure you limit the number of people that have super access, and you limit it to the people that understand what that permission set gives them access to. Probably the biggest thing that you want to go through and do when you're managing your development environment security-wise is you want to define a process. So whether you have developers on staff or you have users on staff that have access to the development environment, or it's your partner, you really want to define a process that makes sense for you. In this case, this control is going to be based off of process and system. And you may have to create you know, kind of a request and approvals process. There's nothing out of the box in NAV to kind of, you know, request customization to your database and then have somebody approve that. It's something that you'll have to kind of come up with for yourself, but whether it's in a help desk ticketing system or it's an email string or it's a form they fill out on SharePoint, just make sure you sit down and really think through how am I going to get the requests, how's it going to get approved, and then where does it go from there? Who does it go to? One of the things as well to keep in mind is if you have a dev, test, and live environment, make sure that you have a process for how things get developed in dev, how they get approved in dev or tested in dev, or moved to test, and how things get tested and signed off in test, and then what's your process for actually deploying those. So make sure you lay out that process, make sure that it really allows you to know what changes are being made to your database, because that's, again, another huge thing that you need to know when you're talking about security just for your NAV database in general. And one of the other things you can consider is who really needs to have access to Super and Live. So it's one of those things where if you can limit that access, if you can say, I'm only going to have one person, they're going to be the one that does deployments, they're not going to do development, they're actually going to deploy it, they're only going to do deployments, it's something that adds an extra level of security for you. So you could have the developer develop and test in live. When it's ready to go to in dev and test, and when it's ready to go to live, it's somebody else that takes that code and actually deploys it to live. And the thing that will do is actually mitigate your risk for, okay, if I'm the developer, I developed it, I move it all the way into live, at the last minute I could put something, in theory, I could put some malicious code in there that maybe will capture, I don't know, credit card numbers, and it's not a real example, I'm just making something up, but you know, that maybe captures credit card numbers and puts them in a file that I grab on a daily basis. It's things like that. So by having two different people deploy the code, it kind of helps to mitigate that in theory. The other thing that you want to make sure is that you have a good process for the versioning and comments in the code of the actual objects that have been customized. It's really important to understand the changes that are made to those objects. to know who did them, to know the date that that occurred, so that if there is ever a problem, you can go back and really know who did it, what it was supposed to do, is it doing what you said it was supposed to do, and then also what version, so that you can roll back versions as well. And we'll take just a quick look at that in a second. So let's go over here. So we're going to go in the development environment here. So let's say, for example, there was a request to modify the customer table. I want to add a new field. So that request goes through the request and approval process. The developer gets it. What you want to make sure is that you have a good process for documentation. So, for example, making sure that you document the time it occurred, who did it, using initials, names, whatever makes sense. I'm tying this for this example to a work order, and then I'm also documenting what I actually did. I can't tell you the number of times I've read documentation inside of objects that make no sense, and it's really hard to go through and look for the actual documentation. In this example, I'm just adding a field, so I'm not actually adding code anywhere in here. But again, it's always good to document your code. Like, for example, if I added these 2 lines, I would add documentation above and below that matches this part of it, so that I can tie the code that I added back to what its functionality is supposed to be. And then the other thing that I've done is actually where I added the field, I again added the date, my initials, and the work order, so that it all ties together. And then when you go out here, also added the version. A lot of times people will kind of skip this part, but it makes it easier, especially if I had to modify multiple objects for this, to actually use this version tag. So then if I said, for example, I'm just going to add this to another one here. So if I needed to filter, I can now filter and see everything that was for that work order. So again, it's all about making it easy to tell when somebody has changed your database, and making sure you can see who did it, when they did it, and what was changed. So that's all a huge part of making sure that your database is secure. Next thing I want to talk about is security reporting. So there's not, like we talked about in the beginning, there isn't any really standard functionality to pull out reports for permissions reviews, to pull out reports for the change log. All of that stuff is pretty manual. So it's going to be stuff that you're going to have to either look at on the screen, save some filters, export to Excel, build your own. So again, it's a lot of building either SQL queries, SSRS reports, JET reports. Any of those things that you have access to can help build some of those out. And you want to make sure, even if when you build those reports, that somebody's reviewing those on a regular basis. So, internally it's a good idea to sit down and really figure out what makes sense. Who should review them, how often, and the sign-off. And that's something you can kind of add to your design document as well, is, you've identified all of the, if you've identified all of the departments, you've identified, the roles, the areas, you can actually kind of say, okay, well, the CFO should be reviewing the AP manager and the assistant controller or controller, something like that. And then the AP manager should be reviewing the AP staff, and the AR manager should be reviewing the AR staff permissions. So it's things that, as you design security, those are things that you want to keep in mind. Those are things that you want to make sure happen on a regular basis. And then I'm just going to do a quick time check here. It looks like we're getting towards the end of the hour. Is there any questions that anybody has?
Just a reminder, you can raise your hand or type the question into the question box. Kim, I don't see any questions yet.
Okay. And if you don't have a question now, but you think of one later, my email is there. So feel free to email me if you have any questions that come up later on.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for attending today.